welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah. So, in brief, for new listeners or something, who are you? What do you do?
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Chris Ferdinandi, and I help people learn vanilla JavaScript. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term or are worried that that's yet another JavaScript framework you need to learn, it's just a generic term that people started using originally as a joke a few years ago to describe like browser native or platform native JavaScript. So just kind of the stuff you get out of the box when you install a web browser. And then at some point it became like something people used seriously as a way to distinguish from libraries and frameworks and all that other stuff. And so a big part of what I do is teach people how to code, mostly in JavaScript. Ironically, spending most of my time trying to encourage people to use less of it. And I believe that there's a simpler, more resilient way to make things for the web. So I spend my time creating courses, writing ebooks, running some online workshops, and publishing a daily, or every weekday anyways, newsletter that goes out to almost 14,000 developers over at gomakethings.com.
Yeah, that's 14,000. That's a nice number because, like I think I mentioned that when I emailed you that this feels like a topic that I have been thinking about sort of off on the side, but it didn't feel to me like anyone else was really thinking about the same things. So I was so happy to discover that someone else was actually doing it.
Yeah, it's been kind of a fun little journey. I'm self-taught, and so a lot of my original kind of draw to this was I got into JavaScript because I knew CSS and HTML well enough, and I kept failing job interviews because my JavaScript skills were weak. So I started learning, and every tutorial always kind of included all these, I think, assumptions around what someone who was just learning might already know, and I found that really frustrating. So I started writing about what I was learning, both as a way to help me kind of remember it later, because I have a really bad memory, and also just to help other people in case they were going through the same thing. But that was back when jQuery was still like the big thing. And a lot of what we have on the web now exists, in my opinion, largely because of jQuery. Like, it kind of showed us how we might do things with a nicer, easier API. And somewhere along the line, I started to feel like the whole web development experience was getting harder, both for people who were learning and also, I think, for the people who were using our things. We started relying on JavaScript a lot more, and it started creating these experiences that are a lot more fragile, that break a lot more easily, that are prone to some really nasty bugs. And so somewhere along the way, I started becoming like the vanilla JS guy, the old man yelling at the clouds, telling all the youngins to stop using so much JavaScript.
Yeah. I hadn't looked at it in years, but I just checked now, and vanilla-js.com is still up and running.
Yeah, I actually kind of hate that site because I run into, it's like, if you get it, it's funny, but I run into so many like young developers who don't get that it's a joke. And get like really tripped up by like, they're like, I click the download link and the file has nothing in it. What am I doing wrong? And like, so
yeah.
It's maybe it's a little too sarcastic for some people.
Yeah. So we should mention, I guess, that it's a site that presents that Vanilla.js is a fast, lightweight, cross-platform framework for building incredible, powerful JavaScript applications. And then it has buttons for you to package your own download. And no matter what you check, it's all 0 bytes uncompressed and 25 bytes gzipped, because it's all standard JavaScript functionality of the browsers.
Yeah. And so I've even seen people complaining about like yet another JavaScript library to learn and that sort of thing. So yeah. So it's one of those, it's funny if you get it, but I do sometimes worry that it confuses people.
Yeah. I feel like maybe there was a point to it back in the big jQuery heydays, because it feels like some people assume that you couldn't do anything without building on top of it.
Yeah, there was also a period where we had like every other week some new thing some new JavaScript tool was coming out. And yeah, there was a lot of like, you can't, actually I see that even today though, that you can't build a site without a library. Usually these days the word like, or the phrase at scale gets thrown in there. Like,
of course.
Node.js is great, but if you're gonna build a real app, if you're gonna build like a site that needs to scale, you need to use React or nothing against React, but you don't need those tools for a lot of things.
No, definitely. I mean, I use React at work myself, and and I'm completely into the idea that you don't need it all the time. It's useful for some stuff, but
this is kind of a nice transition point. So I think a lot of folks just assume that I'm against libraries, just like kind of across the board because of what I do. And I think for me the thing is these tools exist because the companies or teams that created them needed to solve a very specific set of problems. So like if you look at something like React, Facebook has this really sprawling UI that has a lot of moving parts and a lot of stuff in it that's driven by a data set and managing all that and updating it in real time as kind of a like live stream updating type app or kind of feed model. That was difficult. So they built a tool that helped them do that more easily. React is really good at that in a UI that has a lot of complexity to it. But we tend to just kind of do, if it's good enough for Facebook, it's good enough for everything else. And we throw this really large tool at all these other things. Like I've even seen it used for, like a few pages of like, just a simple static website. It's way too much for that. It's like trying to hang a painting on your wall with a sledgehammer. There's too much. You could do it, but it's almost like it's harder and worse than just using the appropriate tool for the thing you're trying to build. And so that's really my big thing. Like I see tools like React as perfect for a very like narrow and specific set of use cases, and like really terrible choice for a lot of things we actually do use it for. Yeah,
and then it's also some kind of slippery slope, I feel. Once one of a certain set of tools has sort of snuck its way in, you might as well add all the other ones around it, and then you might be using like bits and pieces of this whole stack that you suddenly have running.
Even within a library, like a lot of the more like the libraries that people call frameworks, right? So like React and Vue and things like that. Once you're in that ecosystem, and you have access to all of the components and plugins, I found it's very easy for people to stop caring about just throwing one more of them in because I think in their mind, I've already paid the kind of the tax of having the library, so I might as well get the most out of it. And there are some really great components written for React and Vue and other libraries. And then there are some really bad ones that introduce a whole ton of end user issues and things like that. And I sometimes see this perspective that like because it's designed to plug in with this library, it's like been vetted and it's we know it's good. And sometimes these components have accessibility issues or performance issues. I think we as developers tend to get really hung up on like the bug end of it. So we really like the whole it's been tested and it's been used and we know it's going to run, and that's what I care about, because it is in particular in like agency environments or fast-paced corporate environments where like there's a lot of pressure to churn out a lot of stuff really fast. Like I get the appeal of these. You can just grab a bunch of parts, duct tape them together, and you're good to go. But a lot of times they create they create issues for the people who use your stuff, or they create maintenance issues for the people who have to work on it long after you've left the company. We work in an industry where people tend to change jobs a lot. And so I don't think folks always get to experience their like the pain of their own tech choices as much as maybe they should. That would help a lot too. Like if you had to work on the terrible thing you did 6 years ago, you might be a little bit more cautious about the decisions you make.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting point because I work at a product company and I've been working at the same place for a long time relative to the business. And I wonder if that has shaped my thinking about this, because I feel really hesitant about, stacking frameworks on top of each other and, maintaining it over the long term. But the people who talk about building and using these big frameworks, maybe they're more of the consultant type people who, we start a new application at a new company every 6 months. Mm-hmm. We need to get going really fast. And then I sit over on the product company side and think, well, getting going really fast, that's this really small percentage of the whole application lifetime. maybe people in companies like the ones like my situation should be thinking about this in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. I've run into things where like, so at my last actual job, before I was running my own education business, I was there for like 7 years maybe, which was a pretty long time. And I inherited this thing that had gotten built and then never really worked on again. And one of most of the code was written in like, there was some PHP and some Java mixed in. It was a lot of like back-endy stuff that was spitting out this HTML, and I didn't have access to touch any of it. Over time, I ended up kind of creating this JavaScript thing to like scrape some data and update the UI kind of after the fact. And like, there was a whole lot of reasons why you shouldn't do that. And I resisted doing it for a really long time. But eventually I hit a point where like the business was telling me you need to get X done. And I had no other way to get those things done. And so I'd imagine, just to be fair, I'd imagine there are a lot of folks who work in places where there's tremendous business pressure to do certain things.
Oh yeah, of course.
And not enough time or access to certain parts of the code base to do them other ways. Yeah. And that sucks. I think that's worse for everybody.
Yeah, but it's probably a good use case for vanilla JavaScript as well, because nothing lets you get in the cracks between other things better than something without a framework.
That is true. Yeah.
So the whole vanilla focus for you, so to speak, it grew out of starting to write down these things and picking up your own JavaScript skills.
Yeah, it was kind of accidental. So I learned when jQuery was still like the thing. And so I originally learned jQuery flavored JavaScript is how I usually describe it.
Yeah.
And so I could code, but then so I got a little bit further in most job interviews after that, but then I'd still fall down when they'd ask me kind of like, maybe more, I guess if I had a computer science degree, some of the questions would have made sense. Or I felt like I didn't really know what I was talking about. Like I could do a thing with jQuery, but I couldn't tell you why it worked or how it worked or whether it was a good or bad decision. So I started taking like jQuery plugins that I had written, or just scripts written in jQuery, and trying to reverse engineer them into vanilla JavaScript. And I was doing this at a time when ES5 had just come out, and they had stolen a lot of conventions from jQuery. So we got like query selector and query selector all, the class list API, just some really good stuff that made working with the DOM a lot easier. So it was kind of like the perfect time to start doing this. And then I read a post from Dave Rupert that I will try to pull up so we can drop it in the show notes about how he ripped jQuery out of his WordPress install and saw his page load times increase by like 1 to 3 seconds. It was like a pretty substantial like performance improvement. And so that sent me down this whole like web performance kick, where I got really into vanilla JavaScript just purely as a performance boosting kind of thing. And then the big libraries came out. So once like React and Vue started coming out, I found myself doubling down a lot more on not using those tools, just because they seem so damn complicated and unnecessary for a lot of, at least what I was trying to do at the time.
First, you need a build step. Wait a minute.
Yeah, that really kind of ruined it for me. But yeah, so I started off, it was just kind of, I was publishing articles on my site. And that was always really kind of helpful because I could just go to my own website at gomakethings.com and look up something I'd written about before that I'd forgotten how to do.
Yeah.
And then, so then from there I ended up creating a I packaged together a little like ebook of like a bunch of stuff I'd learned. That eventually became a series of ebooks. And then I had people asking me if I had a video version of that. So that ended up becoming a series of video courses. So they're basically like mirrors of the book, just in video format. And then eventually I ended up kind of spinning up this like 6-week long workshop program.
Wow.
I think one of the big things I hear from folks, right, is like they'll read a bunch of tutorials, they'll memorize all of the different like APIs and methods and things you could use, and then they'll sit down to work on a project from scratch, and they really have a tough time like knowing how to put the pieces together to build a complete thing.
Yeah.
And so that's where the workshop really comes in. It's every other day for 6 weeks you are building a thing. There's a project to work on. And so it starts really small and works you up. And the whole point of it is to teach people how to build stuff with code from scratch. Yeah.
Wow. That's a really, it's a really fascinating project or approach.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been it's been like 6 or 7 years in the making. These things kind of.
Yeah, it sounds like it came really nice and gradual as well, right?
Yeah. I tend to I didn't really like plan all this out. It just kind of happens that way. I tend to drift from one little thing to the next in life, so it's worked out nice.
Yeah, but I mean, had you done other kinds of teaching before, or I mean, was it work? Yeah,
sort of. Actually, yeah. I often forget to mention this. So in a previous life, before I was the Vanilla.js guy, before I did programming at all, I was in human resources. Most of my time in HR was spent working in training and development, mostly focused on career development. Mm-hmm. But so a lot of what I did was teaching software engineers how to find and get their next job, move around internally within a company, things like that, figure out what they want to do next. And so when I got sick of that, I had been teaching engineers how to like find their next job for several years. So I kind of used that to kind of plot my own path into this industry. Yeah. But I also had a lot of experience with teaching others, delivering presentations, things of that nature. Yeah. So yeah, it felt pretty, just kind of felt like a natural extension of stuff I already like to do.
Yeah. It seems like it comes in really handy when you're suddenly planning a 6-week course.
For sure.
For developers, no less. Or maybe I should ask that. Is it mainly developers who take it, or is it?
Yeah. So I primarily work with early career developers. So either people who are trying to get into the industry or have just started. I also work with a lot of designers who want to learn code.
Oh, yeah.
So that's like a really huge subset of my audience is people who kind of maybe they're already comfortable with CSS or HTML. Maybe they're more like the design and software type. But it's always kind of this group of folks who wants to learn how to actually take the things they've designed and make them look good, or actually like make them work in a browser rather.
Yeah.
I love having those folks in my my workshop because my projects always look horrible, like visually just terrible because they're bare bones, like they're just designed to work. Yeah. And I can always tell who has a design background because their stuff looks like beautiful and it's got custom typography and like they've really gone like the extra kilometer every time, like
yeah. And they're probably like, oh, that was the easy fun part.
yeah. Actually, I get that a lot. Like, I spent way too much time on the design and I should have been working on.
So is there any particular like difference in thinking about JavaScript or thinking about programming, but or how the two groups, programmers and non-programmers, approach the subjects?
Not necessarily. Although I find that folks who have a design background often feel a little bit less, I want to say, secure or confident in their abilities. So they tend to be a lot more, what's the word I'm thinking of here? I'm trying to think of I can't come up with a good way to describe this other than they maybe don't always feel as confident about kind of their knowledge or how good of a job they've done on a particular thing. And I don't know if it's from being around developers who can sometimes be a certain way, or what have you. I guess the flip side of that is I find designers are sometimes a lot more aware of the kind of the user impacts of some of the things that we build. So they tend to be a lot more, just generally, I hate to kind of just overgeneralize here, but a lot of the designers that I've worked with tend to be a lot more focused on what your code choices or how your code choices will impact users. And I think that's a great thing. I think that's a really kind of good asset, or it's a nice benefit, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I was thinking maybe developers have sort of, I don't know, grown up or been indoctrinated into big frameworks. Do they get any particular like aha moments or something like that from getting more into vanilla?
Yeah. So I hear, I hear things like, I didn't realize you could do so much without a library.
Yeah.
I more often have students who tried to learn libraries, struggle, quit, learn vanilla JavaScript, and then go back and be like, oh, wow, learning React was a lot easier now that I understand the fundamentals a lot better.
Yeah.
Because a lot of what you do within these libraries is vanilla JavaScript.
Yeah.
And, so picking up on some of that stuff, I think becomes a lot easier for folks once they kind of understand how some of the stuff works under the hood. I also have one of my, I have a course on state-based UI over at vanillajs.com, vanillajsguides.com rather. And it doesn't look at any of the big libraries. It actually, the whole process is we are going to build our own small Vanilla.js library just so you can understand how they work under the hood. And so, it gets into things like what is state, what is DOM diffing, what are some security considerations around kind of updating the UI, based on third-party data, and then how do libraries actually look at an existing UI and the one that it should look like and figure out what needs to change. And so we write some code to actually do that. It's not necessarily like I don't think people should write a library like that and then go use it on their big projects, but it's helpful to understand because there's a lot of things that you could mess up there. But it is really, I think, useful for understanding how a lot of these tools work under the hood. After going through kind of the experience of creating that myself, I came away with a really big appreciation for how much work goes into creating these libraries and all the stuff that they can actually do.
And also what they're good for and not good for.
And what they're good for, what they're not. Because there's some stuff they do really, really well.
Sometimes I feel like we make framework choices as if they could save us from having to understand what they do, but it's not really until you understand that at least slightly deeper level that you can really pick a good framework. It feels like some kind of, I don't know, circular reasoning or circle to get stuck in. But I mean, sometimes, this must be a hard problem. I must pick a popular framework. And then I tried to tell myself that, I don't need to understand what's going on here because I have a framework.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's one of my favorite, I guess courses when it comes to a somewhat larger popular framework. Dan Abramov, the creator of Redux, he has it's a course on Egghead, I think, about how Redux works and how it's built. And the whole little course basically writes all the code necessary to do basic Redux.
That's awesome.
It's really that thing you said, showing you how little is involved in getting this thing working, and it's not doing anything magical.
I am a sucker for a good how it works under the hood course. I think it's really useful. It's not necessary. So, I get one of the other things I get asked a lot is like, do you need to learn vanilla JS before you learn a library? Should you learn a library first? I actually don't think the order matters all that much. I'm a big fan of like when you're just learning how to code. I think the most important thing is keeping your momentum going. And where I see most students fail is when they get really stuck on something and can't figure out how to move forward, because you get disheartened and you just give up.
Yeah.
And the students who tend to do the best are the ones who have a series of like really quick, easy wins where they have an idea and they make it into a thing that actually works, and then they can keep going. And so if jQuery is the thing that helps you do that easiest, go for it. If it's React or Vue, go for it. If it's vanilla JS, awesome. I'm here to help. But for any of those libraries, you can always you can always back your way into vanilla JS if you want to do that. And I think that's a good thing. And in some cases, it actually makes it easier because you can create these mental maps between, okay, if I do this thing in Vue, here's how I would do it in jQuery. Or sorry, in vanilla JS. I'm like bouncing all over the place here.
Yeah. Why not?
And I mean, to be honest, there are plenty of developers who they have careers never learning, kind of that under the hood vanilla JS. Just like I don't know how to wire a circuit board to make my computer run, but I still think it's a good thing for folks to learn. Just one of the things I've found from watching students kind of go through learning journeys over the last like 6 or 7 years now is understanding how JavaScript works underneath your library, like what kind of makes it work rather, does two things. First, it helps you learn other libraries a lot more quickly. If you understand kind of the underlying code, it's really easy to jump from React to Vue to Svelt to something else. You have a much better sense for kind of what's actually happening there. The other thing is I've heard from people who write mostly in say React all day, that learning vanilla JS helped them write React better. Because by understanding what React would actually be doing with the code they wrote, they were able to write it in ways that made more sense. That in a lot of cases, they found there was things they were doing like with some complex React kind of steps that they could just cut out and do straight with vanilla JS. They didn't have to bother with some other things at all. So yeah, do you have to learn it? No, I think it's a very good thing if you do.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are always things where your thinking can be helped by understanding what is built on top of. I feel like there's been a nice evolution in recent, or quite a few years now, where the popular frameworks are starting to look more and more like plain JavaScript. I feel like there was a time when people were trying to build these big frameworks which tried to look like preferably anything but JavaScript. It's like, we have this class-based inheritance structure, or we have our own whole little universe of objects or something, but we really try to not look like JavaScript. And nowadays, things embrace JavaScript more, I guess.
Yeah, and I actually, I think I see the ecosystem moving in an even further direction. So, one of the, what am I trying to say? So for a while, jQuery was like the big thing.
Yep.
And then we went through this phase of, it's state-based UI libraries with React and Vue, and everybody forgets about Angular. Poor Angular. They're still around. It's terrible, but it's still there. Now I'm seeing kind of this next wave of tools that I think they're designed to have a similar authoring experience to what you get with like a React or a Vue, but without punishing the user for that choice, without sending 30 to 100 kilobytes of JavaScript down the wire. So you've got things like Svelt and Astro, which let you write like framework-ish kind of code, and then they compile it into what is mostly just vanilla JavaScript and static HTML. and that's what actually gets shipped to the user. And so I think that's really cool. I don't necessarily love authoring code in that kind of style, but I know there's a lot of folks who do. And so if that's you, I think these tools are much better for the long-term health of the web than what we've been doing up to this point. So just as an example for folks who aren't familiar, so Svelt, which you can find at svelt.dev, you write code. You have a piece of, so you can create state, you can create some data, and you create some UI as a JavaScript object, and you can have data in that HTML that is linked to the data. So like if you update a variable or a property of a variable, the UI is supposed to get updated. And then you run Svelte to compile it, and it will spit out mostly HTML and a little bit of JavaScript that manually updates that little piece of the UI the same way you would if you were kind of handwriting vanilla JS, but without you having to think about it. So I think that's a really neat thing. It gets people the authoring experience they seem to really like, but an end user experience that's a lot faster and more resilient. Building on the shoulders of that, there's this newer tool called Astro that does the same thing, but allows you to use almost any library you want. So rather than having to write these .svelte files like you would with Svelte, you can use Svelte files. You can also use React, Vue, and a handful of others, and just kind of mix and match them all together, and it will do the same thing. It'll compile them into mostly vanilla JavaScript and HTML. So these tools are really cool. I'm excited to see how this kind of space evolves.
Yeah, which direction it will move in.
Yeah, I see that as the next big wave, though. Like the way JavaScript UI libraries kind of took over for the last 5-ish years or so, I see this kind of doing the same thing. So it'll be curious to see how things kind of change over time.
Yeah, and what the step after that would be. I mean, it's fun to think. First, you had something like React building in a big experience, shipping kind of the same thing, and then now you're still building the same way and they're shipping something smaller. Maybe you should start writing the smaller thing. But
yeah, so this kind of, at some point. So if we're talking really big picture, this is actually kind of an interesting thought experience. So one of the things I get asked about a lot is, like, where do I see the web kind of going in the next 10 years or so? And like in the short term, I see tools like Svelte and Astro starting to become more and more popular. But for me, I think I also just like jQuery led to a bunch of native browser methods and APIs that borrowed from jQuery and made working on the web easier. I think that React and Vue and other libraries are going to we're going to see the same thing have happened from them. So like right now, there's an API in the works that will sanitize HTML strings for you. So one of the big dangers with using third-party data is people can run cross-site scripting attacks on you by injecting HTML that runs code that does bad things. And most libraries have code built into them that sanitizes out dangerous stuff for you. So they'll remove any like on error event kind of triggers and things like that on your HTML elements and stuff like that. So there's an API for the browser that's, I think it's on stage 3 right now, but it would effectively allow you to pass in a string of HTML, which you could easily generate with a template literal and some variables, much like authoring with JSX, and sanitize it so that you could just inject it into the UI without causing issues.
Wow.
One of the things that I think is missing that I would love to see is a way to diff the DOM using HTML strings. So I would really love if I could pass in a parent element to some sort of like native browser method and a string for what the HTML should look like, and just have the browser be like, okay, if these two things don't match, make them match by making as few changes as possible, versus now where like if you use inner HTML to do that, you're wiping out everything. So if you have like form fields and someone's typed in them, that all gets wiped out. Like I'd love a way to do something that's more like what React or Vue do with these just kind of selective UI changes, but without me having to manually do that. Yeah. So my hope is that we take some of the best parts of library-based development and just make it native in the browser, and eliminate a lot of the issues that we have now.
Yeah. I mean, if the browsers implemented that properly, would we really need React for all that many things?
No, I mean, I would argue we don't really need React for all that many things now anyways.
No.
But no, I think that's, for me, that's kind of the big thing is if browsers did kind of that core functionality, the needs for React would go away to an extent. I think one of the other places where libraries really kind of maintain their popularity is the component aspect of it, where if you use React, there's a bunch of components to implement things you might want to put in your UI, drop-down menus and tab navigations and modals and things like that. And so the other piece of this is I want more browser native components. So like right now we have, for example, the details and summary elements can be used to create an expand and collapse or show hide kind of component. Read more, read less, whatever. In a browser native, super performant, accessible way that also progressively enhances itself. So if someone's for some reason still using Internet Explorer, they can still access the content. And I want more stuff like that. I want components like that for drop-down menus and accordions and tab menus and all the things. And I know, like, for example, we have the dialogue element for making modals, but you need to write your own JavaScript to make it work. Whereas like details and summary is just interactive out of the box. And I want browsers to ship more stuff like that, because I think one of the problems we have now is developers either have to trust that third-party components are built accessibly, or spend a lot of time kind of learning. I don't mean this the way this is going to sound. I was like learning accessibility when they could be doing other things. Accessibility is really important. I have a whole course on it. I think more developers need to learn accessibility, but it is a really specialized discipline in and of itself. And I think maybe the better way to phrase this is developers shouldn't have to be worrying about what the right ARIA attribute to put on an element is and when to put it on there, and did they mess that up, and now someone who's using a screen reader can't make sense of what's happening in the UI. The browser should be taking care of that for us.
That's a good point.
ARIA is a really nice gap to fill the spaces where HTML doesn't do the job well enough, but HTML should do the job better, I think is
I mean, if you build stuff of the right pieces, it should come along at least decently for the ride, so to speak, I guess.
And so and the other problem here too, right, is like the web standards process is slow on purpose, because once you put something in the platform, it's there forever. Even the good old marquee element, which was deprecated like a decade ago, still works in every browser. Because once you put it in there, you don't like to take it out.
Nope.
Like these native features are really, really slow to get added, and I think libraries fill a gap there, and they kind of they experiment with what could be before browsers have a chance to catch up. I think the problem is once people start using them, they stick around forever. So jQuery is not most people's first choice for library when building for the web today.
No.
jQuery still is on more than half of all the sites on the web. I'm sure most of those are sites that never get updated. But these things just kind of hang around for a while.
It's a difficult.
So my worry is we build a lot of sites with these libraries, and these libraries are going to be around for a really long time. Whether we still need them or not.
It's a very difficult thing, whether we like it or not. How are web components coming along, by the way? Are they doing
anything
useful?
So you can web components are great. I actually just literally last week released a course on web components as well. They're really, I think, exciting and awesome. So for people who aren't aware, so a web component is a set of JavaScript APIs, or browser APIs rather, that you can use to create your own custom elements that have built-in interactivity and style. So, if you wanted to create I'm trying to think of a good example here. So maybe you wanted someone to click a button and it automatically rolls some dice and shows them the result, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than having to hard code a button, some CSS for the way that button should look, an element to display the result in with all the appropriate ARIA kind of stuff around it, and some JavaScript to listen for when the button is clicked and do some math and spit out some numbers. The people who use it could instead add a roll dice element and a JavaScript file, and then that JavaScript file would use these web component APIs to take care of the rest, kind of adding all the other HTML into the UI and hooking up the JavaScript and just doing all that kind of good stuff. Web components are awesome for some pretty specific uses. I think they're great for if you're in an environment where you have a design system. I think they're awesome for that, because now your developers don't have to worry about getting the exact right HTML kind of path. If you mess up your HTML or the classes that you put on things in a traditional design system, you can break things or make them look weird. So web components help you with that. They can also be a nice replacement for what we use components for in React and Vue and stuff now. I think the area where they still need some love is around styling. So constructed style sheets. There we go. Yeah. So right now with web components, if you author them in the shadow DOM, which a lot of people like to do because it encapsulates that element so it doesn't accidentally collide with other stuff in a UI. Styles, like global styles, do not bleed through into that component, and that's on purpose. But that also means that if you have a design system, you are replicating a lot of your CSS for each of these different components. If you have some shared styles that you use across different types of web components. So there's an API that exists to fix that, constructible style sheets that allow you to import CSS files into your JavaScript the same way you would import JavaScript modules or ES modules today, and use them in your web component. The problem is it only works in Chromium browsers at the moment. So it's not in Firefox, it's not in Safari, which makes it a bit of a deal breaker. Even if you use a build tool, like say Rollup, they have a plugin, for that. But it still doesn't work right in the other browsers, and so they won't pick up any of the styles, and sometimes it can actually break the web component altogether. So for now, styling is still not fun. And I don't know. I know a lot of folks like to use lit for web components. I admittedly haven't played with it much. So I don't know if lit solves that issue or not. But we are so close to having fully native, super capable web components. And in my opinion, styling is just that last piece that makes them harder than they should be. I would use them today. I think the styling aspect could be a lot easier.
Yeah, it seems almost a little bit strange that they haven't solved it earlier. I mean, web components have been discussed for quite a while, after all. And I mean, styling is a common thing that people want to do on the web.
This is again where browser vendors move slowly. So
true.
Although actually constructed style sheet or constructible style sheets looks like they were proposed in April of 2021. So really not all that long ago.
Okay.
You're right. I in my head that had happened a lot sooner and the browsers were just being really slow. In Firefox, it is behind a flag. So you could enable it, but it's not going to work for most users. Whereas in Chromium, it's just available to use today. But yeah, web components, they're great. I like them a lot. Like just like with libraries, I don't think they're good for everything. But they do result in some really nice, easy to read HTML. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I should brush up on my web components. It was a long time since I I read up or looked at them.
Yeah, a lot's changed since then.
Yeah, I bet. It usually does on the web, doesn't it? Ooh, wow, time flies. Is there anything else we should throw ourselves into for a couple of minutes?
I'm trying to think. We covered a lot of stuff. The one thing we didn't talk about, right, is the one thing that seems to come up most when I talk about this kind of stuff is like why not libraries anyways? Like who cares?
Good question.
Like, so I am I sometimes I'm a little hard on libraries, and people are like, well, like what's the big deal? Because sometimes I'll talk about how I think they're worse for developers just because of the long-term maintenance of them. Where you're constantly having to update your node bundles or dependencies. But the other piece, I think the more important piece is that these libraries add a lot of JavaScript to the UI. And they abstract a lot of stuff, which has its own performance implications. And these things all result in a worse user experience. And a lot of times we as developers have really good computers and really fast internet connections. And the people who use the things we build often don't. Sometimes they're on, not a feature phone anymore, but like an Amazon phone that's a few generations old, or an iPhone that's like 4 or 5 years old. Even like I live in the United States and I'm in an area with really fast broadband. But as you move into the middle of my country, you get a lot of folks who have really slow internet. Even like I have some friends in the UK, and I hear terrible things about like the internet in certain areas of London where they just haven't updated the infrastructure at all.
Oh yeah.
So like these things that we build end up being so much harder to use for the people who actually use them because we have chosen these bigger libraries.
Yeah.
It's the abstractions they add in make not just the initial load time, but even like user interactions and UI updates and things like that. Everything is slower with a library. And because JavaScript is the most fragile part of the front end stack, if something goes wrong, the whole UI can break. And we've all been to websites before where you just get like a blank white screen, or some like random error kind of displayed in the UI. That's because people choose to use JavaScript for a lot of things that they shouldn't. Like my favorite, right, is like you get, like you're in an app and you're clicking the button and nothing is happening, and then you open up the console and there's a JavaScript error, like some property that's trying to get accessed in the code doesn't exist, so the rest of the code won't run. And like I as a like developer nerd, I always open up the console to see if I can fix what's happening. Like sometimes I'll go into DevTools and I'll update the JavaScript file if it's not minified, like so that things will start working again. But most people can't do that. And so for those reasons, it's not just libraries, it's JavaScript in general. Like I love JavaScript. It's amazing. Most people don't turn it off, but JavaScript does fail often for a whole bunch of reasons. Most of them outside of the user's control. And where HTML or CSS will just kind of move on and not really care, JavaScript just stops running. And that's a terrible thing for the people who use what we build. Yeah.
So fewer lines of JavaScript, fewer places to crash.
Yeah, exactly.
And I was also thinking, now that we're talking about, downsides, that there is we've paid a pretty significant price in developer experience as well when it comes to all the tools we use, because back when the web was simpler, he said, 14,000 years old. You had your window with code on the left side, and then you had the browser on the right, and it was just a save and a reload. And now it's like save, wait for the recompilation. Oh, prettier problem. Oh, I have to lint this. And then, I have 14 outdated libraries with security problems. And why does it take a minute and a half to reload the page again?
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of like browser, text editor, and not much else in between. I do use some light kind of build tooling, and I use a static site generator to create the many HTML files I have for my site.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is. I've worked in environments with the more robust build tools, and you lose a lot of productivity just waiting for the build to compile. Like it really kind of sucks.
Yeah, it's such a and then you have another build step that generates your source maps so that you can look at the source again the way it was supposed to work.
Yeah, that's always kind of struck me as really weird, right?
Yeah, it's surreal.
Yeah, and I understand. Like the flip side of this is there are absolutely some really nice benefits to build tools as well.
Yeah.
So I don't want to minimize that. But I don't know that I'd want to like completely give them up.
No.
But I think the way we do it now is probably a little bit more complicated than it needs to be.
Yeah, I mean, surely there's some place where we could take just one step or two back and let go of a few things and maybe find a more straightforward solution.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's exciting times in any case. Always exciting times on the web.
Indeed. That is, the thing that drew me to web development in the first place was there's always something new to learn. And I like it's the kind of thing where you never have to feel bored. There's always something to keep you engaged if you're someone who gets easily bored.
Yeah.
That can also feel very overwhelming at times, depending on your personality. Like if you're one of those people who tries to keep up with everything. But you'll never be bored.
No. Web development. Stay exciting.
For sure.
Yeah. I guess that's a nice place as any to stop.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I don't think I have anything else to add, so that sounds perfect.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Chris. This was very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This was great. I've been updating the notes as we talk. I'll make sure I drop anything I referenced that isn't in there already. I'll send some links your way for listeners.
Perfect.
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.